Brent. So maybe just to pick up on that, the hydrological benefits. I mean, Bruce would have probably could have taken 3 or 4 hours to take us through something of the hydrological benefits, because they, or the hydrological models, what they show. I mean, it's very, it is quite complicated scenarios, and it all depends on, in a sense, what you're exactly looking for. And at the end of the day, the moment you do remove timber or sugarcane, you do get a benefit. The question of how much depends entirely on the context of the situation. In other words, if you are in certain catchments, and this really is the issue, is that let's just take a wetland which has got a supporting catchment. If that catchment is largely planted, maybe 60 to 80% planted, you can delineate happily 20, even 30-meter buffers, but you get correspondingly quite little benefit because the catchment hydrology has been compromised. And there are scenarios like that. So it very much is, it boils down to this thing of one size does not fit all. In other words, if you imposed a delineation and buffer across the board, your expected hydrological benefit may not be as great as you think it is. And as we've seen from the two previous talks, the costs to the individuals as well as the regional economy and all the jobs and all this on might be quite significant. So I suppose what we are essentially putting on the table is the hypothesis that the initial results, and these really are quite early results, of the cost-benefit analysis would indicate that you may not get as much benefit, and it's certainly going to come at quite a big cost, and rather go into a more strategic approach. Strategic being one that is sensitive to the understanding of what's actually happening in the smaller catchments. So, which is really what I want to try and talk about. I'm going to try and put on the table now, as I've grappled with this, I've tried to think, how could we apply this? How could we implement this where it would be so much easier for government or policy environment just to say one size fits all? I mean, obviously that's easier. It just may not, we may not be happy with the unintended results in 10 or 15 years' time. And we want to, when you think how many times you could think back, we could look back on policies from the past and say, that was a disastrous decision. And I mean, I think of the ploughing of wetlands 50 years ago and draining of wetlands that was paid for by the government, in the 50s or 60s. And we can look back now with hindsight and say, what a disaster. Now, we don't want to be doing the same thing here, you see, because those were good scientists doing the best they thought they could for the country and putting in place policies that they thought were right. So we want to just make sure we're getting our ducks in a row. So, so we really do see that wetlands are currently in the focus. Now is the time to be influencing these things. They're not yet cast in stone. Department of Water and Sanitation have their resource strategy document, which really provides for two aspects of management of wetlands. The one is that they want to look at the reactive proactive and reactive, how do you deal with the loss and degradation of wetlands, and they're wanting to maintain these things. This is what they're aiming for, maintain healthy functional systems, so we know that. But we also see that they are aiming for no net loss of our ecosystem functions, wetland ecosystems functions across South Africa. So they're aiming at quite a high standard here. And they're currently drafting their wetland policy, which will become, in a sense, the overarching regulatory instrument that will govern the way DEER and DAF and DWS, who are the primary land use decision makers, how they're going to respond to wetlands. So the point being is that there is a mandate, in a sense, to really do this. And the thing that I've been looking at is this concept of these resource quality objectives, which I feel might present quite a good opportunity for us to achieve what I might call sensible or sensitive wetland delineation and planning, or wetland planning in the production sectors. Now, I'm not sure whether you've come across resource quality objectives. For me, it's novel territory. I came across them earlier this year, and amazingly, they are quite a strong legislative tool that has come into place. So you might be familiar with catchment, the thinking of catchment management agencies or authorities, which will have there'll be a catchment management area. And what they've done is essentially said every single water resource, I'm not going to use their terminology, it's a complete acronym soup to work your way through. But at the end of the day, they can look at individual river reaches, they can look at whole river systems, they might look at individual wetlands or priority catchments. Anything, any way to look at a riverine or wetland or water resource area, they can assign a quality objective. They might, and it can be either quantitative or qualitative. In other words, it could be a verbal description, or it might say we want X number of cubic meters of base winter flow from this particular catchment. And that becomes a gazetted tool. That's the intention of these. These resource quality objectives get decided upon by the scientific community, and then they get set in stone, they get gazetted, and every other single water decision, whether it be a stream flow reduction license or a borehole license or whatever it might be, gets weighed up against these gazetted tools. To me, it was quite a remarkable document to uncover. You might know more about them. For me, it was like a little Raymer moment. But at the end of the day, I think they can be applied. So basically, they turn the ecological reserve, the way people think about the flowing of water, the minimum needed to sustain our ecological systems, and they translate it into a management objective or management goal, which then can decide how to configure and manage our resources. And so they're either numerical or descriptive, and they are designed to ensure the resource is protected. So, for example, this is from a point along the Mgeni River. These are currently under the gazetting process. So there's a hydrological resource quality objective in terms of the amount of runoff and meters. I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's really just an example. You can see there's a water quality objective, and there's also a habitat and biota objective where they would say we want it to be in a minimum condition, habitat status or eco status like that. So this would be one example of the articulation of a resource quality objective. So we are primarily talking about the Umvoti to Umzimkhulu water management area, and they've set 3 levels of these RQOs. The first one is, these are specifically for wetlands. I haven't looked at the riverine systems, but the wetland RQOs are articulated like this. They've got 4 priority wetland systems, you might say. The one would be, for example, Mgeni Vlei, which is the source of the Mgeni River. In Sekeni Vlei, there is another one down further south. I think there's Mvoti Vlei and the swamp near Underberg. So they've just said that these are priority wetland systems, and they are identified more at a specialist level. Probably quite important to us is the priority catchments. So they've looked at the ecological importance and sensitivity, and they've graded the quaternary catchments to prioritize those that would, in a sense, be more valuable from a wetland management. And they've said they will set resource quality objectives for those whole catchments. I want to unpack that one a little bit coming forward, because I think it presents the opportunity we're looking for. And then they've said, well, all other wetlands that are not covered in the previous 2 RQOs, we will also set condition scores for those in a grouped level, not individually. I mean, there's many thousands of wetlands. So if we look at the high priority wetlands, so these would be the large ones, I've mentioned them, Mvoti Vlei, Mgeni Vlei, and so on. They're basically ones that are identified through the literature, Ramsar sites or birding areas or so on. And they would come up with these resource quality objectives that would look something like this. I've just copied this out of the document. And it's really around water availability, habitat, and biota. I'm not going to go into the detail. I'm just presenting it as an example. They, in a sense, are set in stone, and we're not too worried about them. Interesting for me is this thing of the priority catchments. So we've got this 2012 assessment, which they prioritized the quaternary catchments and coded them as moderate high or very high for their ecological importance and sensitivity. So I hate acronyms. In fact, a little gripe on the side. If you're ever writing a technical document, just don't use acronyms. Write it out in full, because that person's brain has to go in full. Right, a little gripe on the side. Anyway, moving along swiftly. But for the priority catchments, they are presenting an average ecological score category, which they are using or determined using the within wetlands condition scores for based on the catchment land use activities and condition factors. And the goal, the quality objective in this case, is to for the wetlands in those priority catchments is to maintain or improve upon the average condition of the wetlands within there. So just to make that real, for example, you might have a wetland that is completely surrounded by timber or sugar, for example. That would reduce its condition score, because part of that condition score is articulated in terms of the catchment configuration around it. So if we are wanting to influence land use on the landscape, we can say, well, if we're wanting to maintain or improve that average score, we might have to change something of the configuration of that particular catchment. So these again are some of the examples of the articulation of the RQOs. There's a descriptive, it's largely descriptive, and this is where I think the articulation could change. If we could influence the RQOs to make them more specific or more quantitative, I feel like we could influence the land use of that. And it would be sensitive to the catchments in which these wetlands occur. So for example, you've got many wetlands that are not in levels 1 and 2 of those RQOs, but we are wanting to maintain the ecosystem services of all of these catchments. So the way I would see this, I'm just going to go to this slide here, is this is now a catchment, quaternary catchment U20F here. So you'll see I've got my delineated wetland or what I call water resource boundary, because it's riparian zones and other things like that. Now the current RQO would be set for that entire boundary. I think if we could move into a much finer scale, it doesn't have to be this fine, but these are now all the individual sub-basins that are contributing to the flow of this flow of water that comes out here just below Albert Falls Dam. The RQO, you might say, let's just say, for example, is articulated in that we want the minimum base flows for coming out of this catchment to be a certain amount in winter, or whatever it might be. I'm just going to use winter base flows as an example. I'm not a hydrologist, by the way, so I'm really grappling in trying to get my head around this. I think you could build up from that point to say, well, let's say this group of sub-catchments or basins that with the grey that's got sugar in it, the objective would be to say, well, we want to achieve a proportional contribution of water flow to come out of the catchment. And we want our wetlands to be in a certain minimum condition to achieve that. And then what that does is that leaves let's say that was a group of farmers or the Noordsburg Cane Growers Association, or it might have been, let's just say it was a timber area over here. It might be a small grower, NCT small grower area. You don't tell them how to specifically achieve the RQO. You're just putting it out there. You're saying this area needs to contribute a certain amount of the quality objective, and you can achieve that then as best you can, in your own way. So that would allow for a scenario like this, where you've got this myriad of tiny fingers, which if you were to buffer all of those, as Steve was pointing out, it would create a management nightmare for the landowners, including a weed management problem and all sorts of things. You couldn't burn that landscape easily because it's just a finger, all these massive tiny fingers. Maybe they might say, well, if we weren't trying to achieve our resource quality objectives in that area, but if we came a little bit further down, you might say, well, if we put really big buffers along those wetlands, we might be able to achieve the resource quality objective. In doing so, you're giving the land managers opportunity to choose how best to configure or achieve the resource quality objectives. Ideally, this would rely on a fairly strong catchment management agency, which are, although a legislative tool, don't yet exist in practice. They're coming aboard. But to take a landscape approach to looking at how these landscapes deliver water, and the hydrological models would be quite a key part of that, and try to find the best value for money within the landscape in terms of knowing that there's a cost to society and individuals. You would then say, well, we can get the best return if we try to achieve it in different areas, not expecting everybody just to do the same thing just because the legislation requires it. I also think a big thing is we've there's a potential distraction here with having a sector bias. So up until now, the last 20 or 30 years or so, timber has borne the brunt of the I'm not in defense of them, but a lot of the focus has been on the timber industry. I think that focus is moving on to the sugar industry. But there are many examples where other crops, for example, there's ploughed up wetlands, drained wetlands, huge wetland. I mean, that is like one wetland system there that has been modified. And it might be that you could achieve a lot of your resource quality objectives by the restoration and the filling in of drains of a single wetland system, and a lot more potentially achievable at lower cost than might be found by trying to delineate endless little bits and pieces within a compromised catchment that has lost a lot of its hydrology. And then I think very importantly as part of this, we have to think about how to pay for this. And I know Duncan's talking a little bit later in the day, or is it tomorrow, I can't remember, about pricing of water and as a way to pay for catchment protection. I think it's absolutely vital that we start to see water as in a sense, a farmable commodity, that it's a legitimate crop and that land users can be reimbursed for sound management of their catchments. So I'm going to end with that, and I'm happy to take a question of clarity, and then we will hopefully go into discussions.